Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This is the first episode of the Svarim Chatter series on early American rabbis, which will air throughout the summer. There will be a break after this episode for 3 weeks related material, and then this series will resume for the rest of the summer and will air on Sundays. If anyone would like to sponsor any of those episodes, you can email me, or you can check out a link in the show notes below, or message me on WhatsApp if you're on the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by KosherKlaf.com. One thing I appreciate about KosherKlaf.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a Megillah, or even a Sefer Torah, they take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit KosherKlaf.com, KosherKlaf.com, or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link in the show notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter status if you prefer seeing things that way. Also, if you can please subscribe to the podcast, rate the podcast, review the podcast, wherever it is that you listen. Finally, enjoy this first episode on the Early American Rabbi series, and please message me, email me any feedback you may have on this episode, on future episodes. Also to note, early American rabbis, we mean until 1900 around, so not going to go past 1900, but any further suggestions or comments or feedback, please reach out and let me know, and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and the first episode in a new series here on Svarim Chatter about the early American rabbinate. And this episode, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Jonathan Sarna, who is University Professor Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, the Chief Historian at the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, and a number of other things, as well as the author of numerous titles, books, articles, and many other things pertaining to American Jewish history. And this first episode will be discussing, I guess, a little background information that is important in the beginning, but really the focus will be on the Reverend Gershom Seixas, or Rabbi in air quotes, if you will. We're going to get into that. So thank you, Professor Sarna, for joining me once again.
Delighted to be with you.
I also want to mention that this episode is dedicated by Seth Haberman, Lezecha Nishmas, his parents, Simon and Eva Haberman. So, let's start off. Let's jump right in to talk about. We'll get to Seixas shortly, but let's even start pre-revolutionary time, colonial America. What's going on? Not in American history, well, somewhat, but really in Jewish history. What's the state of the Jewish community? The origins of the community? What's going on in America, Jewish-wise, pre-revolution?
So, you get a tiny group of immigrants in the middle of the 17th century. Traditional date is 1654, and that's a kind of a good date because the big Jewish community in Brazil, Recife, had been conquered by Portugal. They gave the Jews I think 6 months to leave. And when Jews are given that kind of time limit, if they have sense, they take the hint. So you see tremendous movement of Jews, most of them either back to Holland or to England and many elsewhere in the Caribbean, but a small number come to the furthest reaches of the Dutch Empire, which was New Amsterdam. We know it as New York. There were perhaps one or two Jewish traders already in New Amsterdam when this boatload, traditional number 23, Jews arrived. That's the beginning. This colonial period, especially in the 18th century, we see other port communities. Jews live in port cities, a reminder that they are merchants, and it stretches Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, but it's not a big community. There's 1,500 to 2,500 Jews is the general estimate. Even though, and this is interesting and important for our topic, it's a mixture of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And they have to live together because they're a very small community. But they daven, all of the synagogues follow the Sephardic custom. And Minhag Sfarad, really the Western Sephardic liturgy, and they're all rather similar to one another, and they are governed by what they call the junta, the same Spanish word as junta. The wealthy Jews run it with a parnas, the president, and they hire a full or part-time chazan who knows how to lead the service, knows the nusach, reads the Torah, and handles various other matters. And each of the communities apparently was that way. We know much more about New York because we had many more papers and records from Shirat Israel in New York, whereas many of the others, no records survive. But that's what it is. Tiny communities, much inferior to the Jewish communities of Curacao or Suriname or Jamaica, all in the Caribbean, all of them more significant, and several of them, at different times at least, had a real chacham, had a Sephardic prayer leader, remembering that the Sfaradim did not use the title Rabbi. They used the title Chacham, believing that the rabbinate had ended, official rabbinate. But America, the North American colonies, not one of them had a Chacham. All they had was a Chazan, and if they had questions of a difficult nature, they would send them to Amsterdam, excuse me, to Amsterdam or to England or somewhere that had a luminary, knowing that even their access to books was somewhat limited.
Yeah, and that's important, what you just mentioned, which is that the community was the S&P, the Spanish and Portuguese community, former Marano or Converso community, headquartered in Amsterdam and then spreading out all over. And really all the big communities that you mentioned, Jamaica and Suriname and Curacao, these are all Spanish and Portuguese, all Sephardim, as well as the community that comes and starts off in New Amsterdam and New York and then spreads throughout the Americas. And so it's modeled after their style community where they have a mamad, or as you say, it ends up, they change the name. They have a board run by the lay leaders, by the rich people, and then they hire the rabbi or the chazan, as we'll get to. So the community is run a certain way, and that's really what it is. Of course, we get Ashkenazim coming, but it's not till much later that the Ashkenazim will become the majority. The majority is Sephardi. The communities are run Sephardi. They daven. Well, not a majority, but I think, like you were saying, the ones in charge.
I mean, Jacob Rader Marcus showed that there were more Ashkenazim in New York, even quite early, than recognized. But I don't want to underestimate how important it is that they have to work together and they marry one another. In London, the two communities are not supposed to marry one another. And in a marriage was when a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi married one another. You don't find that in North America. It was too small. They only have, I mean, you're not going to see Ashkenazim and Sephardim in separate synagogues until B'nai Jeshurun breaks away in 1825. But that's a long period. That's 175 years that they're going to work together. And each community was a little different in terms of the Ashkenazim and Sephardim. So, for example, in Savannah, where you had a big and significant Sephardi community, when Spain threatens to invade Savannah, the Sephardim run away. They know what will happen to them. But the Ashkenazim, and people forget this, are not subject to the Inquisition. The Inquisition could only go after people who had been Christian at one time, like Marano, conversos is the right term. Ashkenazim had none of that history, and so in Savannah, the Ashkenazim, Sheftel, minus, those are the two family names, they stay, and the Sephardim run away. So each community is different, but Mikveh Israel in Savannah, even without Sfaradim, continues to be a Sephardi congregation. And in Philadelphia, even though the founder is a Jew named Gratz, who was an Ashkenazi from Gratz, heritage is from Gratz, the city still exists. Nevertheless, they have a sense, this is Minhag HaMakom, this is the custom of the place. It was also more prestigious in some ways, the Sephardi liturgy, so they're all Sfaradim until the 19th century.
Yeah, and that's definitely important to emphasize and important to point out. And, you mentioned there was no rabbis, so we're going to get to the rabbis. I think one that came up on a previous podcast I did about Jamaica a number of years ago with Stanley Mervis was Rabbi Yoshia Pardo is buried in Jamaica. He was a rabbi. I think his father-in-law was Sholef and Mortera, the chief rabbi of Amsterdam. So we're talking about there are some. He's buried there. Definitely were, as you said, in Jamaica, and there were. And we'll talk about Carrigal a little bit, who makes an appearance in the United States as a rabbi. But definitely there really were. And so that's something that we should get to, like the rabbi of the Chazan. But also before that, what's the religious level, the level of religiosity in America at this time?
So, clearly it's not tremendously high. In some ways, you could say there were as many ways of being Jewish as there were Jews. You had some people who were very strict about Shabbat. You can see it in their letters. The Sabbath is coming, they stop. Aaron Lopez is a good example, the great Jew in Newport, and even though he was deeply involved in business, he kept Shabbat strictly, and there is a sense that there were other Jews who did, and of course we know there were quite a few who did not, or who were strict at home, but not so strict away from home. You begin to see a variety of permutations, but what is important is that much of their Judaism is what was handed down to them rather than what they read in Sfarim. They didn't have Sfarim. And sometimes there were debates over, what the tradition is. And since you did have in these communities people who had lived in different places, they could have an outsized influence. And they knew that there was much that they didn't know. We're going to discuss Gershom Seixas. He knew perfectly well that his son-in-law, who had studied in the yeshiva of Natan Adler in Frankfurt, that his son-in-law had much more learning than he did. And in his later years, he would sometimes defer to him. But they wanted to keep Judaism alive. And in the Sephardic world, tradition was enormously important. Doing what your parents and their parents and so forth had done. And of course, they had certain holidays, which, as we know, were particularly significant for Sephardic Jews. who carried with them memories of the Inquisition, the expulsion, and so on. That was, I hate to make this comparison, but that was for them like the Shoah. They knew it, they passed it to their children, and stories of relatives who had gone through the Inquisition, or who, like Lopez, had to escape from Portugal um, uh, with the Inquisition on their tails. Those stories were passed down, parents to children.
You mentioned Seixas' son-in-law, and perhaps we'll get to that's Kershit, and we'll get to him somewhat a little later. Okay, now I believe you mentioned so the community would hire a chazan, which we should talk about what a chazan is. But one other thing before that is so it's interesting. Like there's no rabbinate, there is no rabbis in America. And in fact, something that you've written about, like I believe to like 1840, there are no ordained rabbis in the United States. Why the sorry state of the rabbinate in this country, and what led to this, and how did it even though we'll jump ahead of Seixas for a minute, how did it eventually change? Or we can leave it for the end.
I tend to think that they didn't want a rabbi, and the reason I think they didn't want a rabbi is twofold. First of all, I think that the Ashkenazim were quite nervous. A rabbi would come with his sense of how the shul should be, and it might be different from what it had been before. He wouldn't pander to, or cater, let's say, to the needs of people who had a different tradition. Whereas the lay leaders, they would make deals in Sheretz Israel. It's clear. Oh, we've had a few Sephardi presidents. We need an Ashkenazi president now. And they'd go back and forth. And they were worried a rabbi might not want that. But it's worth remembering Jews had rabbis in places where the surrounding community had important ministers. Jews didn't want to be embarrassed. But in New York, you had many churches that didn't have ministers. There was a great shortage of Christian ministers, and therefore Jews were not embarrassed before their neighbors, and there were all sorts of what we might call learned lay people who played important religious roles among Protestants as among Jews. Protestants are not the same as Catholics in that regard, and so those two factors. And of course, it was very expensive. A rabbi needed to be properly compensated, and when you had a very small Jewish community, that was hard to do. So when you put all of that together, it's not so hard to understand why they didn't have a rabbi. But I do think over time it did become important for them to have a central leader who could be called upon. The president is inaugurated when you needed a leader of the Jewish community who would stand opposite his Christian counterparts. And that will be important to the story here.
Yes, we get to Seixas. They needed some sort of minister. And the one thing to discuss, the final thing before we get to him, so they had this sort of chazan, as they call it, and this will come up throughout the series as I get to other episodes on Lisa and others, was a chazan. But for here, what if you can define for the listeners, what exactly was a chazan? How do we define their background, their training, education, and what their functionary was?
Yeah, the word chazan, of course, we think of as cantor, and that's certainly true that he had to be someone who knew the liturgy and in a Sephardic sense That was important. It was fixed. There were set tunes, different tunes for different holidays. That was a given. Reading the Torah and the Haftarah, similarly, was something they had to be able to do. But when we actually look, we see, and Seixas is a great example, they were a kind of Jewish factotum, what we would call in Yiddish a kolboinik. Almost all of them performed milah. They were the ritual circumcisers of the community. Seixas took this very seriously. There were different times non-chazanim who knew milah, but a chazan knew milah. Seixas knew shchita, and he would slaughter animals for the community, not regularly, but he not only knew how to do it, he knew how to inspect knives of people who did do it, and that was crucial then. And a good chazan had to also be something of a pastor and someone who could help individual Jews at difficult times, whether it was plagues or deaths or other difficult moments. A good chazan would be able to tend the flock, so to speak, on such occasions. And Seixas also was the teacher, and so were other chazanim. I don't mean teacher in terms of someone who would be seen today as on a very high level of learning, but someone had to train you how to read Hebrew, how to prepare for a bar mitzvah. It was not as significant as a bar mitzvah would be today, but these folks taught reading and writing of Hebrew, and we certainly can see lay people. A famous example would be Mordecai Manuel Noah, a lay person, later a leader of the Jewish community, but knew some Hebrew, and we have things that he wrote, his name and so on, in Hebrew, and was familiar enough with the language to be able to read and worship. So all of that had to be taught, and the chazan taught it. So the chazan, and of course, as the community grew, the chazan would be spending more and more time on those duties. In smaller communities, it might be a part-time job. In large communities, it became a full-time job.
So let's turn to that full-time chazan who is the focal point of this episode, and Gershom with M, Seixas, yes. Someone who's in New York and Philadelphia and the big communities. And I think, we can term him the lengthy article / book, the title of Jacob Rader Marcus, The Handsome Young Priest in the Black Gown, The Personal World of Gershom Seixas. I think it's, for those who have, if you see his portrait, you can just Google him. You'll see the picture. You can see why he's writing The Handsome Young Priest. But let's talk about him and his biography. It's called Reverend, as you mentioned, you mentioned the Protestant ministers at the time, the Reverend. So this is what they came to call, him as well. But let's talk about, he's a native of America, I would say United States, but pre-United States, actually. What's his biography, his family, where's he born, when's he born? Let's talk about Seixas.
He's actually the first native-born Jewish religious leader. Seixas is the product of Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and that was probably important. That's why they chose him. He was only about 22, 23, and I think they chose him over other folks. At first he was local and known, but both sides thought, he'll be fine. He understands our traditions. His mother is Ashkenaziyah. His father is Sephardi, with all of the traditions of roots on the Iberian Peninsula, an escape story, and so on. Some people have questioned it, but what's important is that's the story that people knew. The Mendes, and he's part of a family really of quite remarkable people. He has a brother who is a banker and a very important lay leader in Newport. We know him because he's the person who writes to George Washington and the famous letter, which for a long time, by the way, was in the Seixas family, their private possession to George Washington. That was Moses Seixas. And there were other members of the family as well. And I believe there were Seixases around to this day. Seixas, as I said, is appointed at a very young age to this position. Apparently, he was one of these youngsters who was deeply attracted to the world of the synagogue. We don't know a lot about what propelled him. And I would say that there are kind of two distinct periods in his life. There's the period up to the American Revolution. And in that period, he's still a younger man, as they'd say in Yiddish. He's still pretty young, not, just pushing 30. And he was dominated and had to be quite respectful and even fearful of the leadership of the congregation. And then comes the revolution, and he and many, but not all members of Sheret Israel, but those who support the breakaway Americans, goes to Stratford in Connecticut, and later he moved to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, there is this new congregation because Philadelphia is full of refugees from other places. They found a congregation. There's a rich Jew named Chaim Solomon who pays for half of the synagogue, and they hire Seixas as their chazan. And then, after the revolution, Sheret Israel wants Seixas to come back, and here's where we see a new Seixas who makes conditions. He wants a living wage. He wants to be treated with considerable respect. He wants to ensure decorum. He felt that the services were indecorous. Too many people talked while he was trying to lead. And of course, that never happens today. And he wanted a certain authority to shape Sheret Israel into something that non-Jews who visited and Jews who visited would respect. And since they wanted him back very badly, there weren't exactly other people who they could turn to. So lo and behold, they hire him, they accept his conditions, and suddenly, Seixas, this is when he becomes Reverend Seixas, and we see that he quickly makes friends among some of the Protestant clergy of the time. He interacts with them, and of course, because he had promoted and supported the revolution, he also has new respect from congregants and from neighbors. And from the time he returned until, which is 1784, really for the next 30 years, he dies in 1816, he's going to be the leading Jewish figure. And when the Jewish community needs somebody to stand up to celebrate the Constitution, to give a sermon on the day when the president calls for a fast, it's always Seixas. And they depended on him, and he came through. And we see, indeed, there's a wonderful letter from the man I mentioned before, Mordecai Noah, who's younger, born 1785, how much they respected Reverend Seixas. And he made them feel proud that they could admit, yes, we're members of this congregation. And you even, on rare occasion, hear him called Rabbi, but only when Jews needed to show him off to the larger community and thought that title would help. I've never seen him call himself Rabbi, and he certainly did not have pretensions to the kind of learning that he knew a real rabbi would need.
A lot of things to elaborate on and break down, but I want to jump all the way back. He mentioned his brother, Moses Seixas, the very important letter where Washington responds, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." Very famous letter to Newport. So that was to his brother. Now, you kind of mentioned Gershom Seixas, and let's just take it there at the end. You said how he is not a rabbi, so he's an autodidact. Whatever he knows, he's self-taught. He said he's a native, and we already mentioned the situation in America at the time. So his education consisted of whatever he could learn himself and whatever he
can. Yes.
Yes, he didn't have a rigorous Hebrew education.
No, he certainly knew Hebrew, and certainly read Hebrew, and we actually have the Dutch prayer book at the Center for Jewish History. You could see I say Dutch meaning it had been printed in Amsterdam, that he used, and he has notes in his own hand of things that they did at Sheretz Israel, but they're no novella, and he quotes in his extant sermons, quotes the Bible. The one Talmudic quote is actually a mistake, so that he didn't know the Talmud, and it's not clear to me that there were lots of copies of the Talmud. My sense is there were almost none, if any. But he does seem, at least in his last years, to have had access to the Shulchan Aruch. And on one occasion, in a document, strangely quotes the Maharil, but it's hard to know what to make of any of that. But look, he did what he could. Honestly, there were all sorts of later communities in America, in the West, on the frontier, that had those kinds of individuals. They cared a lot about the Jews. They knew more than their congregants did. And if the neighbors respected them, and they were good pastors, then they did very important work in transmitting Judaism from one generation to the next.
For sure. And as you mentioned, he was a chazan in the literal sense. He was a moil. As you talked about, he considered this a very important role. He was a sheikhet. He did a lot of different things, assist the community, and so he was a sort of reverend or quote-unquote rabbi at the time. Definitely one of Seixas' things. And so there's a couple of other things as well. We talk about so he's in New York. And at the time of the revolution, he's 30 years old, and then he has this kind of heroic. He escapes with the Sifrei Torah. They run out. I mean, you want to relay the story? I mean, is there what about the veracity of the story? Is that actually like an accurate story? Like, how did it happen?
Later, most of those stories come later. He has a lot of children. He's married twice. His first wife died, so he has, I think, 16 children, 14 of whom live. So there are all sorts of stories that are passed on, and as descendants are wont to do, they elevate the father and grandfather's greatness and add exciting details. We don't know much about his decision to leave. What we do know is that some stayed behind, and there were also Hessians, meaning Germans, the British, paid and imported into America to help them fight, and some of them were Jews, and they kept Shevet Israel going. There's at least one Sefer Torah that Seixas doesn't take. We know that because that Sefer Torah is desecrated by the British soldiers, and there's a whole scandal around it, and the soldiers are very severely punished. But as time went on, his descendants tell lots of stories of the heroism of their father. I would say, though, that the very act of leaving, and we know that he sometimes traveled into the city to conduct important life cycle events. The other heroic aspect of Seixas, which we have quite a few records on, is that during epidemics, he stayed. He stayed with his flock, risking his life, believing as he did that that's what a religious leader had to do. So whereas many of the Parnasim, many of the rich business folks ran to safer places, he didn't. And that later was well remembered and again became part of the Seixas legend. And it does, though, suggest that he was a courageous person and that he had principles which he acted upon. That's very important for a rabbi, even today.
Absolutely, and as well that he was a true American patriot, and that's something that also was well remembered, especially when the United States when they won and became the United States of America.
Right, and we know, for example, that in Newport, the Chazan, who was much more learned, Turo, but he backed the British, and he had to leave, and he, except by his own children, is not remembered nearly so well. One can contrast the Newport and the New York situation.
Another thing that's important to elaborate on a little bit, and we mentioned this with the Chazan, but also you mentioned how he came back. So he went, he leaves New York, and then he goes to Philadelphia, and he's hired there for a while, and then he comes back from as Mikveh Israel comes to share with Israel, he comes back to New York. But the thing is, and then he makes certain demands. And what's important is that even throughout the process, but certainly before that, before he's this kind of household name, the Chazan is a hired job by the Mamad or the junta. So they run, the board controls him. It's not a rabbi where, even if a rabbi is hired in something like that, the rabbi runs things to an extent. This wasn't the case. Generally, with all Chazanim, and even Seixas, he was a hired figure, right? Everything was reported to the board.
Yeah, he was a hired figure. And look, we will see the same with the rabbinate. The most important thing to remember is while there were countries, as in modern Israel, where there was a central body that hired and placed rabbis, think England, that is not the case. It is totally congregational. It's very much influenced by the congregational pattern of Jews' neighbors. And there was a certain anti-clericalism as well that feared religious leaders, and Jews were influenced by that idea. Remember that plenty of Puritans hated the British system. And so, but Seixas was more powerful, certainly in his later decades, than any Chazan to his time in North America. And it's a reminder, and in a way anticipates, just as there are certain rabbis who achieve in their community great centrality and power, and not because government appoints them, but because of their personal qualities. So indeed, he is the first of that kind. And that will be a pattern. One can think of others much later in the 20th century, an Eliezer Silver or a Rabbi Soloveitchik, who are going to achieve all sorts of status because of their personal merit, and the community reveres them. Earlier, Isaac Leeser has some of that. Seixas is the very first we can point to who becomes central, and the fact that the surrounding community respects him, of course, means that his Balabatim have to respect him as well, and they do. One can see how talented he was by looking at what happens after he dies in 1816, and Sheretz Israel is filled with machlokas, with disagreements and fights, and there is no leader who is able after him to bring everyone together. And indeed, just less than a decade later, there's going to be a breakaway, and that's going to change American Judaism, really, because all Jews will no longer be united under one shul with one chazan, and suddenly a new competitive market environment is going to be created. But that's after Seixas, just a reminder that he had a lot of skill and must have had a lot of political skill as well. And there are all sorts of hints that he knew how to satisfy different groups, and was an Ohev Shalom. He knew how to make peace among the different factions.
And you mentioned that he enjoyed prestige and respect amongst the Christians, and also he became a trustee / a regent of Columbia College, which was renamed Columbia University now, but renamed after King's College, and after the Revolution. And he became he's a Jew, and he's a rabbi, and he's one of the trustees / regent. I don't know what you call it. How did he get that position? And that's unique as well, that a Jew is in that position at the time.
I mean, after him, you're going to have to wait a long time before there's another Jew. They appointed leading citizens of the community. Almost all of the others were, of course, Christian, all of the others, to that position. And it's not just honorary, because in one of his letters that survives, he tells his daughter how much he enjoys those meetings. He talked to different people there. And we know that he interacted, it was a small town, with other ministers. And he enjoyed the intellectual give and take. He's no Jonathan Edwards. He's not someone who has vast learning and the like, but he had read enough to hold his own in intellectual conversation. He seems to have been deeply interested even in science of the day, and that too contributed to the esteem in which he was held. When they would list all the religious leaders, he'd be there.
You mentioned before his sermons. And let's talk about sermons and writings, because at the time, especially the Chazan, it wasn't standard to give sermons. You know, people think today the rabbi gets up, he speaks every Shabbos multiple times, and during the week, that was not how it worked. So what at his time, during his time?
Not at all.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Indeed, there were Chazanim never spoke, of anything of theirs. Seixas certainly had to submit whatever he wrote to the Parnas before he delivered it. And in some cases, he would write it, but he would deliver it in the name of the Parnas, as if the Parnas had written it, much as the Queen of England gives or the king now gives certain talk. Everybody knows that he didn't write them, but it came from him. Anyway, but it's perfectly clear that Seixas does write them, especially those that are written after the revolution. And some of them are very carefully written. So, for example, at the end of his life, there were divisions in the community, in the congregation, over what we call the War of 1812. And he writes a sermon calling for peace and kind of trying to thread the needle, saying something that both sides would agree to. And at other times, but he spoke rarely, but we have more of his sermons, certainly, than any other Chazan of his time. And actually, there were quite a few Christian clergy whom we don't have as much as we have of Seixas. Jacob Rader Marcus, in his article, book-length article, has a footnote with really everything that we have by Seixas, his sermons, other writings, letters, and altogether we're lucky to have as much as we do.
Yeah, and Marcus really analyzes them, and he goes through them, talking about his whatever he could of his religious outlook and his ideology. I don't know if you have anything to say on that, about what we know of Seixas, what we can glean from these limited, even what we have, it's still limited from what,
I mean, someone else could, as inevitably, I hope maybe someone listening to this broadcast will go and draw their own conclusions. Professor Marcus was a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, and kind of reads them through those eyes. It would seem to me that an Orthodox rabbi and maybe now we have Sephardic leaders in America, I think they might read them a little differently, and it would be a good thing to bring together the entire corpus of Seixas writings so that others would study them. Professor Marcus was the first to understand those letters to his daughter are fascinating. Zev Elef and I used them to shed light on how people got esrogim. Because after all, Seixas was responsible, and he writes to his daughter and talks about, getting esrogim and so on. And similarly, they tell us about the nuts and bolts of the Chazan's job in a Sephardic congregation. You also had to obtain dates, because Sephardim used dates for Charosas on Pesach. and dates are not native to North America. And so things you wouldn't think about, the Chazan had to do.
Do we know how often or when he gave these sermons that we have?
Yeah, I'm sure, first of all, that we don't have a complete set. But most of them are written for an occasion. And many of them are written for, let's say, the president called for a fast day. And the Jews wanted to prove that they participated. And that's when they would call upon him. But I don't think we have even one. I'd have to check it, but I don't think we have, a Shabbos HaGadol drosha of that kind. We do have a moment where he's worried about people who are not sufficiently observant, there's concern about kind of public violation of Shabbat. But most of the moments when we can date his sermons are occasions, the vast majority of them national occasions, when others are giving sermons, and he is as well.
Now, all these sermons are in manuscript.
Yeah, some of them have been printed by now. But if you go to the American Jewish Historical Society, he had a pretty good hand, Seixas. You can read, and they're quite readable, you can read his surviving sermons. It's rather interesting to me that so much survives. That's a signal that the family thought he was an important person, and they were proud of it, and they kept it. Whereas in other cases, the family couldn't wait to get, throw it all out and have more room. But in his case, it seems to me that they tried hard to preserve it.
Another thing that's worth mentioning for the listener is that, you mentioned that he would give, in some of his sermons, you saw that he was worried about the level of observance and so on. This predates the rise of reform in America. That'll come later. So now we're before. I just want to make sure the listener understands. There's no reform. If someone's not observant, they're just not observant.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complete myth that, until the rise of the reform movement, every Jew observes 613 mitzvahs. Anyone who reads communal minutes anywhere, it's not just true in America, will see them worried and so on. I remember, and this was a surprise to me because we don't see it in Germany too much later, but in the minutes of Curacao, they're worried about, I know we're talking about long before the American Revolution, they're worried about youngsters who basically quit Judaism after the bar mitzvah. Many of these things we assume, were modern, they're not so modern. And Professor Marcus, who was himself for movement and at Hebrew Union College, saw anticipations of Reform Judaism here. My sense is it would be more accurate, perhaps, to say that there were in Sheretz Israel folks with very modern ideas who were not observing as much as Chazan Seixas would like. But you can go to many an Orthodox synagogue today and find rabbis who are wish that some of their congregants would be a little frummer and a little more careful. Where he's concerned in the Jewish community, the whole was concerned, was where it was done publicly. And that, I think, they felt in some ways endangered the whole Jewish community. But he seems to have been quick to forgive, meaning he'd welcome people back in. And when you had a very small community of Jews, that was a good strategy. And probably why he was well liked.
End of his life, you mentioned he died in 1816. What's the end of his life like, though? Anything to mention about the end of his life and then where he's buried?
Yeah, so we know where it's not like Moshe Rabbeinu. We know exactly where he's buried. There are stories that at the end of his life was tough. At least one of the eulogies makes reference. Look, he was 70 when he dies. That was a long life in those days. And he, in his letters, refers to his rheumatism, but apparently his last years were painful, and one can see certain lay figures. The most important is a Peixoto from a very famous Sephardic family, stepping in to fill in for him. And when he dies, that same Peixoto will serve for a year at no salary because he was a businessman. And the idea was that the money would go to the Seixas family, because even though he was 70, his second wife was substantially younger than himself. And as I said, he had a bunch of kids, and he had little kids at home still when he died, and it was not easy for the Seixas family. And if one looks at some of the writings at the time when the two factions in Sheretz Israel are fighting with one another, they still remember what they claim were the junta's mistreatment of their great Seixas family when he died. They didn't. Some at least felt that the community didn't give him the money that they ought to for raising those children. That was an ongoing problem in the days before rabbinic pensions and Social Security. It was hard for rabbis who lived on. But anyway, he was very well respected, even if in pain. And when he died, the whole community, including the non-Jewish community, honored him and wrote about him. And he's buried in still the Sheretz Israel cemetery. Before they moved far out of town, which only happened in mid-century.
Yes, he's in the old cemetery. It's still there in New York. For those who want to go see, you can definitely go to his grave. So now, what we mentioned earlier, I just want to come full circle, because Seixas dies in 1816. I guess the next famous Chazan, I would assume to some extent, is Lieser, who's not till late 1828, 1830. He's not really becoming big till even later. So, and he Lieser as well, who we'll leave to a later episode, is Chazan also. He's not an ordained rabbi either. But Seixas, just from Seixas till Lieser, or even if till later, wherever you want to go to, I mean, the rabbinate, kind of what happens after Seixas to the state of, let's call it the rabbinate in this country?
We do not have central figures, and that was more and more of a problem. And of course, we're going to see the Jewish community begin to grow, mostly thanks to German Jews, especially in the wake of the Hep riots, but even before then. And what you have are learned lay people, and especially the immigrants from the German lands. Some of them, I mentioned earlier, Seixas' own son-in-law, had actually had the benefit of studying at a yeshiva. They were known to have some learning, but of course it happened all the time. And we have even later tshuvot about it, where different lay members would fight with one another about what the correct way of acting was. And the poor leaders of the congregation would have to appeal to a European rabbi to get an answer. And of course, that took a tremendous amount of time. So there is a dearth of leaders, and I think that's why there was great excitement in 1840 when finally there is an ordained rabbi. He pronounced it Reese, but it's usually known as Rice. And then we're going to see other rabbis come, some of them influenced by reform, some not. But we're going to see a move, and Zev Elef has well written about the rise of the rabbinate. But anyone who reads even Isaac Mayer Wise's autobiography can see the fights between the lay leaders and rabbis who thought they should be the leaders of the synagogue. In other words, you have fights over authority, and he shows that just as the revolution helped Seixas, so the Civil War helps the rabbis. Jewish communities needed a leader, and the person who gave that leadership was the rabbi who could stand opposite ministerial leaders. And increasingly, that's what you want. And in the second half of the 19th century, you're going to begin to have rabbi doctors, meaning they have the first, and the one who sets a lot of patterns is Rafal, who wears canonicals and is always known as the Reverend Doctor, and is a person of considerable learning. And there's no question that he comes to America in order to establish a pattern. By then, there's a sense American Jewry, which by the time Rafal gets there is 50,000, soon to be 150,000, needs a leader. And the British leaders are sick and tired of having to deal with questions from America. They say, it's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. Seixas anticipates that. He's a kind of transitional figure from the community that is entirely lay-led, where the Parnas had all of the power, to what we will see after the Civil War, where increasingly the rabbis have power.
Yeah, and stay tuned for episodes on Lisa and Rice and Raphael and all of these different figures as they get much later. But Seixas is the one that really starts it. He's the rabbi of the Revolutionary War. He's the one that's here, if you will. And so what would you say in closing is Seixas' legacy?
I think that his legacy is, first of all, he becomes the central Jewish religious figure of his time. People look up to him. He's the representative Jew, and non-Jews look upon him that way, and he earns it, meaning that he holds the community together. He delivers sermons and makes decisions for the community that earn the Jewish community respect. And because he's a native and born American, he's also able to interact easily with his Christian counterparts, which is likewise very important. And in all of those ways, he's a transformational figure, And we can also see him as a transitional figure from a completely lay-led Judaism to a community where rabbis are going to be more and more central in determining religious life.
Okay. So I will link in the show notes. There's the Marcus article / book. If that's available as an article, I'll link to that. I will link to, I'll try to use it. There should be online somewhere to some of his writings that are in the archive. I can try to link to those. I know, and I should mention your book, American Judaism, the second edition, has first few chapters, talks a lot about the initial phase of the Jewish community here in the United States, as well as it talks about Seixas as well. He's a influential figure there as well, so that's worth mentioning. Also,
an article by Tom Kestner that's worth knowing. And of course, David DeSola Poole, who was
She'erith Israel,
but later his successor, so to speak, at She'erith Israel. But like Lisa, who's he's there for a very long time, and he knew a great deal about Seixas and also was heir to various traditions. So his writing about Seixas is also very interesting to see, and you can tell that Poole sympathized in some ways with his distinguished predecessor and was honored to be on the same pulpit.
Yeah, Poole has a book about She'erith Israel, a book about the tombstones, the cemeteries. So there's a couple of writings.
And he has biographies there, yeah.
Yeah, and also one other thing worth mentioning is Adam Jortner's recent book that I had him on the podcast about the Revolutionary War and the Jews. Talks about Seixas as well. So there's a number of different things. I'll try to link to some things, but there, for those interested in reading more about Seixas, you can find that out there. And this is just the first episode, and we'll do more on this series. And thank you, Professor Sarna, for joining me.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Be well.
Thank you.